Hi everyone, welcome to Epic Chess, the channel that helps you improve your chess fast. In today's game we're going to look at a really nice positional chess attack from Alireza Firouzja. He was playing against Nijat Abasov in the recent FIDE Grand Swiss tournament, and the theme of today's game is divert and conquer. So we're going to see how Firouzja uses really nice diversion tactics to move Abasov's pieces away from key squares, distracting them, and then moving his own into those vacant positions. So we'll dive right in here. Firouzja goes pawn to e4, we have pawn to e5, knight f3, knight f6, and this is signalling the start of the Petrov defense, a defense that's usually considered very solid for black. And I'd encourage you to check out the games by Vladimir Kramnik played against Garry Kasparov in their World Championship match 2000 if you are interested in exploring this defence. And now instead of capturing the pawn on e5, after which black would usually go pawn to d6, knight f3, and then knight recaptures on e4, instead we have a different sequence. Firouzja plays pawn to d4, and now black jumps in and takes the pawn on e4 with his knight. You can take this pawn here and it's going into a different line essentially. So the knight jumps in, takes on e4. We now have pawn takes on e5. Again, there are different ways to play here, but okay, we'll follow the game continuation. And now d5 from black, knight to d2 from white. And here black makes a really interesting decision actually, not one that I can say I love. So instead of taking the knight on d2 here, which is a more common reply, and I recall a game in this line between Alexander Grischuk with the white pieces and Fabiano Caruana with black from the 2019 Candidates Tournament. And this game, when knight takes on d2, then it was either bishop d2 or queen d2, I think maybe bishop d2, and after moves like bishop e7, bishop d3, we have pawn to c5, and black gets this really nice pawn center, so that even though white has a lead in development, black has a lot of trumps of his own, with the knight quickly developing, bishop coming to e6, castles. So I prefer this way of playing for black as a setup, and it's a way that I've played in my own games before. Running back here, instead of actually taking that knight on d2, instead black goes bishop to e7 here, allowing white to take on e4, which white now does, and after pawn recaptures we can see that this allows queen takes queen, and we have bishop takes queen here. So Firouzja's gone in for this queen exchange, and black has invited that with the way he's played. And after knight d4 now, the knight's forced to move because it's attacked by the pawn. We have knight to d7 from black, hitting this pawn on e5. Bishop f4, defending. Knight to c5, looking to reroute the knight into this e6 square potentially at a later point. And now we have castles queenside from Firouzja. A nice dual purpose move, getting the king to safety and also developing this rook down the dangerous d file which has been opened. Black now plays pawn to c6 in response. We have bishop to c4 from Firouzja, and now bishop e7 from black, looking to bring that bishop back to a slightly more active square and also bolstering this knight on c5. It should be noted, if we run back a move here, if black tries to play pawn to b5 here, kicking this bishop, forcing it to move back so that it can then be recaptured by the black knight, white actually has a tactical shot in this position. So if you want to pause the video and have a look for that one, then please do so. Here white can actually play knight takes on c6, and if the bishop were to be captured by the pawn, now we can see the power of this rook come into the d file. We've got rook takes on d8, and that's actually checkmate. So coming back to here, that's why black can't play pawn to b5 and instead plays bishop to e7, just trying to move that bishop off the back rank where it's not a tactical shot and allows then the pawn to come to b5. Firouzja now plays rook h to e1, centralizing his second rook. And again, if we just pause the position here, we can take stock of where we're at. We can see already that white has a very dominant position here after only 12 moves or so. Both rooks are in the center of the board, firing down against the black king which hasn't yet castled. We've got three minor pieces on the fourth rank here, controlling lots of space. Black for his part only has the one minor piece developed to their 4th rank. And this light squared bishop on c8 is going to have a hard time coming into the game because it would like to develop to f5, same as how the white bishop has developed to f4, but we can see that this knight on d4 is preventing that, and therefore Firouzja's knight is definitely superior to the black knight in this position, as are both of his bishops and both of his rooks. So a really nice start to the opening for Alireza Firouzja, and that's why I didn't really love the way that black played here with this pawn capture on e4. So black now plays pawn to a5, striking out on the queen side and perhaps dreaming of a queenside attack at a later point. Firouzja plays pawn to h3, looking to strike out with his g-pawn on the king side. Black plays pawn to h5. Now we have a3 from Firouzja, making room for his bishop, so that after pawn to b5, it now has a nice retreat square. If we just actually jump back a couple of moves to here, Firouzja plays h3 here, so we'll play that move through. Now, if black immediately went pawn to b5, the bishop couldn't retreat here, so I think the most likely way that Firouzja would have played would have been bishop to e2, simply retreating and claiming that black has now created weaknesses here, especially this c6 square which the knight can attack. And so that's why in this game we don't see black playing that b5 break until they've moved the bishop to d7 to actually protect the pawn. So coming back to here, after h3 black played h5, we have pawn to a3, now bishop to d7 supporting c6 and preparing b5. We have king b1 from Firouzja, a nice safety first move and a very typical move when you castle queenside. Whether you're white or black, if your king sat on this c file, it's often exposed to checks at a later point in the game, whether down the actual c file or from bishops along these raking diagonals, and therefore it can often make sense just to tuck the king away, get it behind the b pawn where it's well shielded. So black now strikes out with pawn to b5, bishop drops back to a2, and now it's able to maintain its position on this beautiful diagonal, raking down towards the black king. We now have castles from black, and on the one hand this brings the king to safety, but on the other hand we have a ton of pieces now building up against the black king. If we look at this pawn on e5, we've got the knight on d4, bishop on a2, and there are lots of pieces here really raining down in that direction. So whilst it makes sense to take it out of the middle of the board, the king is still far from safe now where it's moved to on the king side. And this is where you might want to pause the video and have a think about what you would play if you were white and trying to intensify the pressure in this position. So we can see that Firouzja just built up a really nice advantage out of the opening, but the question now is, how do you capitalize on that? How do you really seize the advantage? And here we're going to try and focus on diversion tactics. So when looking at the board, we should consider which points in the black position are potentially overloaded. If certain pieces were to be moved away or distracted, then could that lead to an advantage for ourselves? And how would we go about distracting those pieces? So if you want to pause the video and have a think about that, thinking about your trumps in this position, especially this dominant knight on d4 and this backwards pawn on c6, then please do so. So Firouzja here, he plays pawn to g4. A really nice break on the king side and a lovely distraction tactic, trying to play against this bishop on d7. So we have h takes g4, pawn recaptures, and now the challenge is accepted by black. He jumps in and takes this pawn on g4. And if we just run it back and move to here, I can see why black played like this, because if you ignore the pawn, then it's going to start streaming down the king side anyway, and once it reaches g6 you're going to be in all sorts of trouble, because it will force the question on this f pawn as to what it's doing, and it can't recapture because of the deadly pin here, and there's trouble with black bringing pieces to e6 because that's already quite well controlled by two of these white pieces. So black jumps in, he takes the pawn on g4, hitting the rook on d1, and this is where we have a really nice counter shot by Firouzja. So the moment that that bishop took the pawn, it left the defense of this c6 pawn, and this is where Firouzja capitalizes on that. He jumps in, knight takes c6, and the really nice tactic in this position is that if bishop takes on d1, then we have the lovely Zwischenzug, which means in between move. knight takes on e7, check. So the king is now forced to move, and actually we don't even need to recapture this bishop. We can simply play rook to h1, check. Bishop is forced to block, and here we have a really nice checkmate down against the king. I did actually cover this checkmate on another one of my videos. I think it was 36 checkmates, you must know. And the knight here we can see is covering g6 and g8, and therefore this check along the h-file is deadly for the black king. So coming back to here, after knight takes on c6, that's why black didn't take the rook on d1. Instead, black played rook f to e8, protecting that bishop on e7. And now again, if you want to pause the video, have a think about how you might play, then please do so. We're looking to intensify the pressure on the black position here. So how can we start generating threats using our active pieces? We also need to bear in mind the rook on d1 is attacked, and so it needs to find a good square. So here Firouzja plays rook to d5. And again, this sets up a tactical shot, because if the bishop now drops back to hit the rook and then threatens to take the bishop on a2, we have the nice in between move, knight takes check, and after rook recaptures, then we pick up this knight on c5. Again, that bishop was now overloaded, so after we chopped it off, the knight dropped off here. So always look for that in positions. Look for any pieces that seem to be overloaded, because if you can divert them or distract them away, then you can have a key breakthrough or a winning tactic in many positions. So coming back here, dropping the bishop back to e6 is no good. Instead, black tried rook a to c8, hitting this c6 knight, which is causing all sorts of problems. But Firouzja now jumps in with knight a7, double attack on the rook on c8 and the pawn on b5. And black can't really hold on to this. If he tries to play rook to b5 to hold this pawn here, then we can simply drop the bishop back to e3, hitting this c5 knight once again, and it's now hit twice, of course. And if the knight retreats, let's say knight to e6, looking to come in here in the future, well, now we simply pick up the b pawn with knight takes b5, protected by the rook, and really there's a lot of material collapsing in this position for black. So if we run it back to here, after knight a7, instead black tried playing rook to a8, just hitting the knight straight away and trying to get out of any of the tactics along these squares. The knight now chops on b5. We have rook e to b8, hitting the knight, knight c7, attacking the rook, rook a7, picking up a tempo on the knight and also looking to double on the b file. And if you want to pause the position here and think how you might play it, then please do so, bearing in mind that we want to keep the initiative going, and also this knight is actually trapped, so it hasn't got any squares here, as you can see, although Firouzja has calculated this and come up with a nice response after the move rook a7. So here he plays pawn to e6, and this is really a very logical move when you start to increase your chess understanding. So for starters, it opens up this very dangerous bishop on f4, which is now raking down the diagonal, protecting the knight, and also x-raying this rook on b8. It also starts the process of clearing lines along this diagonal. We want to bring this bishop into the game, but this pawn is currently blocking the checks against the king. So if we can start breaking things down along this diagonal, then that's going to be working out well for us to attack the black king. Obviously this takes some calculation though, because we note that the pawn can be taken one of three ways here: by the knight on c5, bishop on g4, or pawn on f7. Black actually ignores all of those threats and simply plays rook a to b7, trying to generate play of his own against this b2 pawn. So Firouzja starts by taking on f7 check, and after king f8 he plays bishop d4, both defending this pawn on b2 and lending more fuel to the attack down this diagonal towards the black king. If we just run things back to this position here, black could have considered taking this pawn on e6, so for example with pawn takes e6, hitting the rook, but after knight recaptures, we already open up this bishop which was mentioned earlier, hitting this unprotected rook on b8. So say we have bishop takes the knight here on e6, well we can simply now chop the rook on b8, and if white were to capture this one, well then we can take with check first, king moves, and then we're picking up this rook on a7 as well. So the whole position's really just collapsing here now for black. Instead, black tried to play this counterplay move, hitting the b pawn. We had pawn takes, king moves, and now black drops the knight back into d7, hitting the bishop and putting the question to it as to where it wants to head. It's trying to hold on to this b2 pawn and also hold on to the knight on c7. And so the best way for white to parry this becomes apparent when you consider the fact that this bishop is very powerfully centralized in the board, holding two strong points, and you also want to keep the initiative going as the white player. So white simply plays rook takes on d7, and after bishop recaptures we have rook to h1, and this was actually the final move in the game. In this position black resigned, and the reason being we can see that this rook is now coming to h8 where it's going to deliver deadly checks along this rank, and with this pawn on f7 boxing everything in, there's really nothing for the black player to do here. So a really nice game from Firouzja there, and I just want to bring it back to this key position in the middle game. So the opening was over, Firouzja had a great position, but how do you capitalise? And this is where I think we can learn a lot in our own games. We see how Firouzja seizes the initiative here, pawn to g4, and after these recaptures, he's forcing the bishop basically to take that pawn or else face an absolutely devastating pawn storm on the king side. And after bishop takes, knight takes c6, that bishop was diverted away from the protection of this pawn. And once this c6 pawn goes, everything is just collapsing for black, especially through the use of good calculation from Firouzja, which he did in this position very well, as he so often does as a very strong grandmaster. So I hope you enjoyed this game. Do let me know if you have any questions or comments. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and I hope to see you again in another video.